All right. So again, we've got I'd say still a packed agenda, and I do appreciate everyone, accepting a little bit later this evening or going up until 9 o'clock. We'll see if we need the time. If not, we can definitely recess early. So we got a number of things we are going to talk about tonight. I would like to have it as a wider group discussion as the predominant point of today's proceedings. So without any further ado, I'll just pass it on to the land acknowledgement, which our trustee Tanya Rocha will be reading for us this evening.
Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions, land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us.
Thanks, Tanya. All right, so for this evening, the first thing we're going to do again is some housekeeping items. So I'll just go through a few matters that I want to bring you all up to speed, and some news as well. Afterwards, we're going to jump right into some new options. So we have a total of 7 for you this evening. They're both the ones that were recommended by our parent representatives, as well as some of the other ones that we've cobbled up together based on the discussions we had last week with our Jamboard sessions and our breakout sessions. Afterwards, what we'll do is we're going to have one breakout session this evening, and we're going to split it up into 2 separate groups this time as opposed to multiple. And we're just going to discuss the new options, as well as if you want to bring up some of the old options too. Afterwards, we're going to have a wider group discussion for the remainder of the evening. So that's where we'll be discussing, what what was discussed in the breakout sessions, and then we'll hopefully have time for some activities too in terms of potentially developing new options tonight. And afterwards, we'll get into next steps, and depending on how time permits, we might be able to get into what to expect for the payment preparation for the next meetings. So we'll see. This is just the survey that Mitch had sent out yesterday evening. We noticed that at the last meeting, we only had 6 respondents on how the first 4 options were rated. We just wanted to make sure that the sample was representative of the wider group, and we were less than half. So if our parent representatives would mind just taking some time to complete this survey, that would be great. I will just put the Menti in the chat, so we don't have to leave this on screen. And we're going to be doing some more Mentimeter surveys this evening too. So if you've got the app loaded up or you're just ready with your device, we'll have those up on screen later. So part 1, housekeeping items. So again, we're just going to do a little bit of a recap on what we discussed last week, just to refresh everyone's minds on where we were with our criteria as well as the options. Hopefully, if you do want to get to if you haven't already rated those 4 options we talked about last week, please do so, and we'll have a chat of what those results look like. And then closer to Mitch will throw in the new slide on the new graph on the slides. We're going to look at the new options. We talked about breakout sessions. We do have the meeting notes that were circulated. So if you just have a look at those and let us know if you have any questions, issues, or any modifications you'd like to make. Otherwise, if we don't hear anything either tonight or later on, we'll give you till the end of the week. We'll just make those meeting notes formal and finalized, and we'll post them online. And then 2 other matters too that came up last week with regards to before and after care and legacy exemption information. So on the before and after care, so we did discuss this with our rep at the school board, and she's had discussions with YMCA Oakville. And for the most part, like a lot of the schools have before and after care, and they have capacity. I think Udnow is the only one that currently has a wait list at the moment, and usually we do coordinate with them in terms of, again, facilitating, making sure we've got as many spaces as possible. But I want to get into a more thorough discussion on that at a later time once we do have the options, so we can at least see, what the potential impacts of that would be. In terms of legacy exemption, again, I want to defer that to a later meeting. I definitely want to focus on legacy exemptions once we have a set of options, core options that are good, and then we can see how we can better the options with legacy exemption. One of the things I want to avoid is, and I also just want to manage expectations too as we go through some of these new options, is that I don't want to make it as perceived as there is a really good possibility that we could legacy exempt everyone. As part of this, I think what that just causes is, A, we're maintaining pressures, or B, we're creating options that don't necessarily last the test of time because we're holding all the students there. So once the whole legacy exemption has been phased out, we're just potentially being in the same issue. And thirdly, too, we don't want something to drag on for 10 years, which is what would happen if we were to keep legacy exemptions in place for all grades. So I just want to keep that back of mind for everybody as they're looking at the options. Look at them at their core as to what they are if we were to move everybody, and then see if there's any way we can accommodate some legacy exemption to, better those options. And we'll talk about that too this evening. But I just want to be, manage the expectations that we're not going to be able to do it for everyone. We may be able to do it for a few grades, but let's first get some good options in front of us that are based on, whole student movements, and then see what we can incorporate afterwards. We can discuss that more as we get into the options later. So again, in terms of the updates, we have provided you new options. Those are all in the folder. We'll also present to you tonight the options that we've developed, but namely just the areas that are impacted. So we're not going to show you all the schools in the option because they are iterations of the other options we reviewed in the last 2 weeks, just so that I can go through it. But in the folder, you'll have all of the numbers there. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that these are I'd say, rough cuts of the options. They're not as in-depthly developed and finalized as the options 1 through 4 were. Because we've received a lot of these as of Monday, and we're working through them as we are now. We've done a rough cut, which is a good enough idea of whether or not it's feasible. And if we see that those options have a good chance of moving forward, then that's where we'll go forward and refine them even further to the same standard as the initial options we presented to you. So we just want to make sure that we provided you with some alternatives tonight, and as many as possible, just so we can spur some good discussion. Last but not least, too, something that we're also going to have to consider. We've received some new information as of last week that that Oakville number 3 will be delayed. Unfortunately, there's been an issue with one of the suppliers, and in terms of that's key to the construction of the school site. It's going to have an impact on the opening timelines for the school. We don't have all the details yet, and we're working through that because it's just recent information. But once we have a better defined construction schedule and we understand exactly what the impacts were to the timing, then we'll be better set in terms of how do we move forward and how does that impact the options. That said, it just means that maybe some of the options we're looking at, we're going to have to defer their implementation, and just be cognizant of that as we're moving forward. So we just wanted to make sure that you're aware of it now, and that we definitely want to have the correct messaging prior to the PIM so that the community is also aware of this information once we have more of it. So it's unfortunate, but it's kind of the reality we're in with some of these tight timelines with new construction projects. Again, all your resources are in your folders and the zone map. So if for tonight, I encourage you just to especially have the option folder ready, as well as the zone projections too, just so that you've got, if you're looking at making other iterations or commentary, that's helpful to have on hand. In terms of the proceedings for the next few meetings, so Mitch did send out just kind of to touch base to see what availabilities would be for next week, this time next week again for another meeting. Let's gauge it at the end of this meeting to see whether or not we are going to need it, and just again see if we need more time to further refine these options, so that when we come back for the November 16th meeting, I just want to be sure that at that point in time we're going to have a short list of options. Again, by the end of that evening, we got to be down to maybe 2 or 3 that we're ready to present to the community. So we'll see how tonight goes and see if we need that last meeting. So just a little bit of a recap on our breakout sessions last week, just to refresh everyone, or for those that weren't able to attend. When we were discussing exactly how we rated the criteria and what level of importance we were placing on those criteria, what we found was that the top 3 was really in and around stability and making sure that the student experience is well accounted for. So really what we looked at, what was most important to you all, was student experience, balance of enrollment, and stable long-term boundaries. Those were all kind of the top ones, and a lot of the options that we're looking at this evening tries to incorporate that as best as possible, especially with the stability side of things. Interestingly enough, something that was also surprising was proximity to school and geographic boundaries. I think that was an interesting mix, because we have a lot of our FI counterparts that are typically bused, that are accustomed to being on a bus, and we also have that balanced out with more the neighborhood school model for some of our English cohorts, and Dr. David R. Williams kind of being that one school that has it both. So that was interesting to see there too. And then again, the one thing I did want to point out, like we hear it loud and clear, stability is what you're looking for. And that's really what we're trying to achieve here. Is the less movement we have down the road, the better. And then once the moves are done, hopefully that's it for a very long while. So we definitely based some of the options that we've, not only the ones that you've provided, but the ones that we've developed, and trying to maintain that. In terms of the outcome, so this was the initial survey last week that we had done. It seemed like number 3 and 4 were definitely ones that the group had seen as the most successful in meeting the criteria. The sum of its parts is what they best achieved, and you're never going to have it perfectly in all the criteria that we looked at earlier, but you try to see which one meets the most of them and the ones that we've prioritized the most. And it seems that based on that, 3 and 4 were ahead of the game there. Option 2 was middle of the pack, and that was the one where we retained some FI in North Oakville, if you recall. And yeah, status quo in option 1 definitely, I think it came loud and clear that for that group, it wasn't well received. This is what we had based on earlier, just the beginning of the presentation. So we still only have 8 respondents, but a little bit of a shift in terms of perception here. Status quo in option 1 still not seen as viable. Option 2 and option 4 kind of shifted in priority here. It seems like option 2 still seems to have some legs in maintaining some presence in North Oakville, and option 4 a little bit less viable, or seen as less preferred in this circumstance. So that's something I definitely want to explore tonight, especially as we look to start removing options and coming down with a more tight set to move forward. And yeah, since the beginning of the meeting, only 1 additional person. So we're still on point here. All right, so with that, I'm going to move on to the new options that we created. So for this, what we did is, and what we worked together with our parent reps that submitted options, is taking a base option and making some further refinements to that option to develop a new one. So here, when we're going to go through them, we're not, when we're saying, zone X is moving to another school, it's not its current school, it's the zone that it was previously at for the other option. So I'll go through it right now. So in this case here, option number 3A is just a variant of option number 3. And this is where we started, we heard you in terms of how can we keep all of the FI kids ultimately moving to another facility together, as opposed to splitting them to 2 different schools. So in this option, we looked at Sunningdale as being the recipient school. And we moved a few things along in some of the other facilities as well, just to make do. So just going more visually here, the English boundary itself remains status quo in this option. So it's one and the same as option number 3. Where we did change things is we took zones H and G from Forest Trails, which is the Udanowi zone, and we sent it over to Dr. David R. Williams. Something else we did in this too is there was a lot of discussion in around, why is MUNS not in its own boundary, the school location versus its boundary, which is currently in Sunningdale's. So we took a stab at it, and we looked at, okay, well, what would it look like if we reestablished the more immediate area of MUNS and brought it back to its own school instead of Sunningdale, because this is typically all of AC would be in Sunningdale, and look at what those numbers look like. One thing that we did note here too, in terms of what some of the advantages are of having that neighborhood model school, is really the walkability to that school. And here what we found is that MUNS, based on where it's located relative to where the population it could serve within its own immediate adjacent neighborhood, it's not really well sited, I would say. In that, a lot of the neighborhood areas are very well distanced. So it requires students to either walk across Upper Middle and down Trafalgar to get to MUNS, or walk through these community areas and walk up Trafalgar to get to Munns. So really the walking coverage between Munns and Sunningdale, whether they go to Munns or Sunningdale, is almost the same. So that was definitely something interesting to note, where you don't really get that benefit, and perhaps that's why it was the boundaries were developed the way they were, because for the most part people are bused one way or another. So I just wanted to put that insight in front of you. So in terms of Forest Trail, in removing that Udinawi cohort, that definitely has a result in reducing its overall enrollment long term. So we are providing for a lot more empty classrooms at Forest Trail. Munns, in this instance, we're taking about 85 additional students from that split AC zone, and we're sending them to Munns. So in the previous option A, Munns was pretty flat, just along the built capacity and fluctuating a bit. Now it's going to be well over, with about 6 to 7 portables long term. With regards to Sunningdale, now that it's taken on both Dr. David R. Williams and Udinawi, it definitely spiked up in the enrollment as well. It does subside over time, but initially it is going to have a number of portables on site, whereas in previous options it just had a couple, or the originating option. So as part of the modifications and what we're considering, and some of the flags as part of this is, this definitely succeeds in that it's aligning the FI cohorts between Udinawi and Dr. David R. Williams, so that's a success. The one counter to that is that we're not balancing our FI enrollment as well. So that's an unfortunate circumstance here. And, we are creating more walkability to Munns in terms of its neighborhood school, but those are also students that would have the ability to walk to Sunningdale. So the proportionate amount that increases at a walk to school isn't as great as you would have expected, or as we would have expected. Option 3B is a further iteration of option 3A and the option 3 itself. This is one where we're sending some of the growth outside of Dr. David R. Williams back to it, so having it act as a holding school for the future Oakville number 4. And then again, the same modifications we're looking at, where we're moving some of the zones from this is where we're taking zones Z, Y, and X, which we're going to be going to Falgarwood. We're sending them now to Dr. David R. Williams. And for the FI boundary, similar to what we just discussed here, we're sending that other portion of Munns over, or back to Munns, from Sunningdale back to Munns. And then Sunningdale is taking on the Udinawi boundary. And here we're just adding more, because we're changing the boundary, we want to align cohorts, and this is now going to Dr. David R. Williams. We're sending those high density developments to Sunningdale as well. So here with Dr. David R. Williams, we're definitely looking at a decrease in initial pressures, but it ramps right back up as zone N starts to develop over time, and as well as zones X, Y, and Z start developing too. So we get back up to the same number of portables that we did before. With Falgarwood, we see a dip in enrollment right back up as development continues. So this is very similar to some of the other options we've seen with Falgarwood as a holding school. Forest Trails, again, we run into the same option where we've got a lot of surplus space being created by taking away Udinawi, so it's almost the same as it was before. Munns, similar to option 3, again, we're seeing a lot more pressure happening because we're taking on those 85 kids in that immediate neighborhood. And Sunningdale further increases because we're taking on that high density development just east of Trafalgar. So really, the same kind of considerations as option 3A in terms of, we're bringing back a boundary to Munns, but also some of the other things where we're not as effective in balancing the FI enrollment in this option either. That's one of the challenges we see here. Dr. David R. Williams, albeit we take away some of the immediate pressure, it ramps right back up down the road, so that's problematic. And the other concern we have too is that now it's really tied to Oakville 4 being open on time, where if there's any delay, then we're looking at a potential redirection or boundary review at Dr. David R. Williams to deal with that. So that's another flag we notice with this option. Option 3C is where we're moving a lot of the, so now we're looking more towards south of Dundas area, and we're starting to play around with post corners boundaries. In this case here, we're taking a lot of the high density development that was at post corners in its immediate boundary, and we're switching it up to sending that to River Oaks and keeping zones AE and AJ to post corners. So these zones over here in the originating option 3, we're going to River Oaks. Now we're leaving them at post corners, and now zone AI where it was as part of Post Corners in option 3, we're just going to send them over to River Oaks. FI wise, no changes here. It's the same as the originating option 3, where they're all going to be going to Sunningdale. In this case here, by removing a lot of that high density growth, so there are existing students in the zone AI and as well as the future growth, it definitely does succeed in bringing Post Corners down to almost its capacity. Down the road, there is going to be some surplus space, but it's still pretty close to its building capacity. In this case here too, River Oaks is definitely dropping in pressure as Oakville number 3 opens, and then it's going to have a sustainable enrollment long term. Just near its overall built capacity. So this is a case that, we are definitely better at balancing out overall enrollment in this option. But one of the things is that now we're increasing the amount of transportation. So that zone AH and AI, those are areas that are very well walkable. They're within that 1.6 kilometer distance. So we're increasing transportation here. Like I mentioned, we have good enrollment distribution, good long-term boundaries. This does primarily affect the high density area, though, along Dundas and in the immediate neighborhood. So that's something to be aware of. In option 3D, this is again where we're looking at moving around zone N from Dr. David R. Williams. So in this case here, the first round of options was mostly zone N that we would have. It was an option 4 where zone N was going to Oakville number 5. In this case, we brought that consideration here over into option 3D. So yeah, that's going over to Oakville number 5 for the English boundary, and then the same is true for the FI boundary as well. There we go. Yeah, and the same is true for FI. So now we're sending that over to, Sunningdale. That's going to be going to Forest Trail instead of Sunningdale. So with regards to Oakville number 5, it's still overall it's still doing okay. We're not going to need to have that new school till 2031, so that gives us about a 1-year buffer as to when we anticipate Oakville number 4 to be available. And again, they're pretty close to their max capacity, so it's there's some wiggle room there. Dr. David R. Williams, with this move here, essentially what we're establishing is just that boundary there with no future growth, so that manages in keeping Dr. David R. Williams right at its capacity line with just a few portables down the road. So taking a lot of those pressures off. Forest Trails, with having the set of schools that it has in zones in this area, it's managing to stay right at its built capacity, maybe a few portables here and there over the years. Sunningdale, same thing. So this is a lot more reflective of the originating option 3, where we're close to the built capacity with maybe a few portables added, nowhere near the max. So this is another one where Dr. David R. Williams is still going to be looking at some portables here and there, but just not to the same level. We have some stable boundaries until the schools do open, and we do have some good distribution of enrollment overall. Now moving on to the option 4 series. So this is where we took the option 4 and just made some minor tweaks to it as well. In this one here, we're looking at, again, at Post Corners and seeing if we can reorient some of those boundaries and keep some of the originating zones to its school and sending others to River Oaks. So again, similar to what we saw in 3B, was we'll take zone AE and AJ, which we initially proposed to send over to River Oaks and keep them within Post Corners. And then zone AH would now go to River Oaks instead of Post Corners. And then zone N here north of Dundas, instead of leaving at Oakville 5, we bring it back to Dr. David R. Williams. With the FI boundaries, we just be aligning everything. So there's not really much that's changing here on the FI side of things. North Oakville number 5 will be growing at a steady pace. Again, we won't need the Oakville number 6 till 2033, and we still have the opportunity to open Oakville number 4 down the road too in 2030. Dr. David R. Williams is one that, it's going to have portables. It'll have a little bit of a dip, and then we'll continue to require portables over the long term with that zone N being in place. With Post Corners, in maintaining a lot of its originating boundary, we're not as successful in reducing some of the pressures being felt at that school. So here we're going to see a slow decline in enrollment, but still requiring portables long term. For River Oaks, we drop initially in the first few years as we open schools, but we are directing some growth back to River Oaks so that it stays at its built capacity for the long run. So in this option here, it's another one where it is going to require more transportation because of the zones that we're keeping at post corners relative to where we're moving them elsewhere. But the enrollment balance is good, and we do have stable boundaries that we can work with in the long term. 4B is another iteration. So in this case here, this is where we're looking, instead of sending zone AH, where we were looking at River Oaks, been looking at post corners. Here we're looking to maybe sending it to Falgarwood as a long-term boundary as opposed to holding, and seeing what that would do. And the same would be done too for the FI side, because this would then be a month's boundary, just to make sure we're aligning cohorts. At least at the elementary panel, this wouldn't align for the secondary panel. Overall, this does bump up Falgarwood to closer to its built capacity. It accelerates when it hits max capacity in 2030 for Oakville number 4. So we're just going to have to be careful there to make sure we open on time. Munns is a little bit more reflective of what we've seen in the past, option 3 and 4, where it's just at its built capacity. Post corners, we succeed in taking a lot of that pressure off long term, so we're managing to bring it down to its built capacity. Sunningdale close to its built capacity with a few portables. So overall, again, this is another one where we are requiring more transportation because of that zone AI and AH and where we're sending them to. We have to be careful with Falgarwood reaching its max capacity by 2030. Again, doesn't give us a lot of flexibility with Oakville number 4 for delayed. And it does, like I mentioned earlier, create a split cohort for that zone AH. On the west side of Trafalgar would be going to White Oaks. And then on the east side, it goes to Iroquois Ridge. So there'd be that misalignment there. And last but not least, option 5. So this one's it's kind of a mixed bag. This is one of the ones that staff developed based on a lot of the comments that were received, but it is based on option 3. Here, I won't go through all of this, but for the most part, what we're doing is we're going back to, if you recall, option A and B, where we're trying to keep the Dr. David R. current FI cohort from Udinawi and itself together. So that's one of the big successes here. And then we're looking at also taking what we've done in the other post-corner alternative options to change it up a bit, what was initially in options 3 and 4, respectively, and sending zones AE and AJ from where we thought of bringing them to River Oaks and sending and keeping them out at post corners. And then here again, we would just be sending the high density growth along the Dundas corridor and Trafalgar corridor to River Oaks. For zone N here, instead of having it at Dr. David R. Williams, we would just send it over to Oakville number 5, again, trying to keep the pressures there as low as possible. And in this instance here, this is where we take both Dr. David R. Williams and Udinawi's boundary of FI students and sending it over to Forest Trail as opposed to Sunningdale. In doing that switch, what we also change is initially we had the Oakville 5 being part of the Forest Trail family of schools. So now instead we're going to be sending that to Sunningdale just to balance out the enrollment numbers. So what that ends up doing is North Oakville number 5, we're good for a while. It won't surpass max capacity till 2031. So that gives us a 1-year buffer with the opening of Oakville number 4. Dr. David R., we managed to really reduce overall pressures at that school. So long term, we'll probably just see max 4 portables after the dip. Forest Trail here is we're taking on a lot more students from Udinawi and Dr. David R. Williams, assuming that they come. So we do go over capacity a little bit more, but over time that does stabilize. So that's certainly something, if you recall back to the example I mentioned earlier, Tumble Legacy exemption, well, maybe this is a case here where, okay, maybe we can keep a few grades at Dr. David R. Williams so that we're not having to increase portables here, but overall the option would work with or without it. So I just want you to keep that in mind. But yeah, here Forest Trail long-term works out. Post corners, again, we take away a lot of the pressures immediately, and then it drops right below its built capacity in around the 90% range, which is just fine. River Oaks stays right at capacity, so it'll have probably a portable on site over the long term, but not much more than that. And then Sunningdale, although it has that initial dip, It will grow over time as that development continues in Oakville number 5, and that way it will be at its built capacity too. It just takes a little bit longer to get there because we're waiting for that Oakville 5 growth to take place. So what's good about this is we don't have any schools that exceed max capacity. We have stable long-term boundary, a good distribution of enrollment. We're again trying to keep the cohort of Udinawi and Dr. David R. Willem together. So although they're moving schools, they're moving together like option 3A and B. There is again that increased need for transportation zone AI and AH in the Post Corners area, or there are at Post Corners right now, which is walkable. And again, it's targeting mostly high density in this option being relocated to another school. We have no split cohorts, and like I said, there is probably some opportunity for legacy exemption just to balance out portables where we can, so that we're not adding them just to remove them later. So happily, we're in the breakout session now, so I can stop talking a little bit. So with that, I do want to break out into 2 separate groups, as I mentioned earlier, and the main theme of this is really going to be to, discuss these new options. They are in the folders, and I know there's a lot there, so you'll have staff there available to help you out in terms of walking through them if you want to ask questions. It'll be much in the same format as last time, where we'll have a Jamboard up. This time we're a little bit more open forum on the Jamboard side of things. We won't have it by option. It's just, if you want to talk about an option, let's talk about that option, because we have many. And just bring up some of the thoughts you have, what you like, what you dislike. Are they meeting the criteria, and do you think there can be improvements? And then, again, same format as last week. Once we get near that 30-minute mark, what I'd say is start maybe thinking about who wants to say what, and then we'll have a debrief as a larger group afterwards. And then we're just going to have a larger open forum discussion about further refining those options and discussing them. So these are the groups here. So Mitch will be kind enough to just kind of split us out in the groups momentarily. We'll all get dumped into our respective areas, and then we can start our discussion. So yeah. Let's have a good discussion, see what we think about these options. Thanks, everyone. If you want to leave it on, all the better. Maybe one more thing too, as we actually, let me just get the presentation up, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so I hope everyone had a good breakout session there. It was time flew, I gotta say. So it means, at least on our group, the discussion was very good. So at this point here, and I'm hoping the same for group number 2. So at this point here, what I'd like to do is, now that we're a wider group, I'd just like to have that overall discussion on, what your group had to say about the options that we reviewed. If there's anything you'd like to summarize with. I forgot to follow my own rules and forgot to pick who was going to present on our behalf. So maybe what I'll do is, Lorene, can you get your group to present your information, and we'll have our facilitators populate this Jamboard over here with the comments that.
Sure. We had a pretty robust conversation. I would invite anybody from our group. I'm looking at like Jessica, or even Allison or Young, if you want to, or even Jennifer, to sort of contribute to the presentation of our, a brief presentation of our discussion that just happened.
Okay, sure, I can do that. We talked quite a bit about option 5. It does, in our view, it took into account a lot of the concerns from last week and incorporated them in perhaps a more artful way than the puzzle piece approach that we had tried to take last week. One of the things that we talked about was perhaps looking at DDW, Post Corners, and River Oaks, and moving around some of those areas to, in the English stream, make those schools more walkable neighborhood schools. We even talked about whether AH is too large an area as it's currently drawn, given the high density in that area. You know, the other high density areas, X, Y, Z, are very small, and AH by comparison is quite big. There might be opportunity to move some low rise into the walkable Post Corners community. And there might be some opportunity to move AE and AJ into River Oaks to increase walkability there. And then on the FI side, we talked about, so in English, we talked about moving N into Dr. David R. Williams, understanding that the development in that area is not yet approved. It's unknown whether it will be low density, high density. If it is high density or predominantly high density, that may not be able to stay in that boundary. DDW being built as a smaller school, you know, it is what it is. It's an 800 kid school, not a 1,000 kid school. But it would recognize the neighborhood school approach, in which case we'd also need to look at keeping N in the Forest Trail catchment for the FI, so that every kid who attends grade 1 at DDW will end up with kids that they know, whether they stay in the English program or they move to the FI program altogether to Forest Trail. And I think that was the I don't think I missed any other important points that we talked about. Well, we did also talk about the high density areas, and that we don't want those schools those students to feel separate and not a part of their school community. By and large, those areas are being bused, and Lorene provided the helpful context or insight that actually busing from high density is quite convenient, because it's not, they can all wait in the lobby of their building to be picked up at a single spot, rather than multiple stops through a low density neighborhood. So I think that helped resolve that concern for our group.
Thanks, Jessica. I think it covered everything. The one takeaway, at least for myself and for planning staff, I think, is to take another look at zone AH. So Fred, we did talk a lot about AH in terms of how potentially AH might be a too big of a zone and could potentially be split up, where we can send parts of the south part of AH, potentially keeping that Post Corners, because that is definitely walkable to Post Corners, but still also consider a bulk of the potential high density in AH, to possibly play around with that area and have that redirected to River Oaks or to somewhere else. So that is something we can maybe move forward with in terms of developing more options, and looking at that zone AH, and to satisfy some of the considerations regarding Post Corners and River Oaks.
So yeah, and that's kind of where what I was hearing is like more of a, pardon me, like kind of an offshoot of option 5, where we're we're keeping FI relatively the same, saving except for Zone N. We'll have a look at that. And then also reviewing post corners and see if it's something that's more akin to what we had, like the original option 3 and 4, and splitting AH. And I guess, Lorena, I think we got a mix of stacks and high density towers in AH, right? If I recall.
Yeah, and there's a mix of stacks, there's a mix of low density, a mix of high density, and a mix of long-term new growth that won't be happening for quite some time as well, that could be redirected. So AH is it's a mixed bag of existing and brand new development. So that's definitely, we could take another look and play around with that, possibly splitting up that area.
All right, so what I'm hearing is zone, probably like an option 5A and 5B, just kind of playing around with some iterations.
That, yes, and with Zone N as well. So the appreciation was there in terms of keeping Dr. David R. Williams and Udinawe to one school. So I think that was very well received with in option 5. I guess with Zone N, sorry, and correct me if I got this correct, Jessica, is that there is a possibility that N is considered more of a community with Dr. David R. Williams. So because it potentially could, depending on the road network, it could be, some parts could be walkable to Dr. David R. So they would want to possibly retain that idea of having a more walkable school from Zone N. But in any case, I did notify that Zone N would most likely be involved in the next round of boundary reviews, i.e. The number 4 and number 6 boundary reviews coming down the line. So as long as there's that understanding, that is, we can look at Zone N, putting them back into Dr. David R.
I think that's fair. Okay.
I see Joanna raised her hand. Go ahead, Joanna.
Yes, hi. I do agree. It looks like Zone N should belong to Dr. R. Williams. And I'm wondering, do we have any information from Town of Oakville around their plans for how that area will be developed? Right now, it looks like largely green space. So I'm wondering if some of that will be protected or if there's plans for development.
So at this point, I do believe that we have 2 development applications circulated from the Town of Oakville in Zone N of 600 low density units at this point. I do know that a big portion of it is natural heritage system lands, which means they're protected and would not be developed. I do know that there are proposed high density blocks along Trafalgar, the west side of Trafalgar, which is part of Zone N. I could go back and take another look at the draft plans and give you a more precise answer to that later
okay,
on.
So just to follow up, and maybe that's the part you're going to get to, is based on those 2 applications, development applications to the town, were you able to work out some kind of scenarios to get a rough estimate of how many students we could anticipate in Zone N? And would they be able to be accommodated into Dr. David R. Williams?
Yes, we do. We have calculated the projection for Zone N, so it is there. And we do have current options that have been developed that do take L, M, and N into Dr. David R. Williams. So those options do exist, and we can look at those, take another look at those numbers again in the context of option 5.
Thank you.
I think there's another hand before Jessica's. I can't remember who it was. I'm sorry.
I think
it was me, but you answered the question already, Lauren.
Okay.
I was just looking online and as a realtor, what I have access to, and it's just showing me that there is right now by 2025 March, there's going to be a 349 unit building that's coming up over there. But that's the only thing. Like everything else, I guess, is still under review.
Yeah, I think it's still under draft plan submission right now. So usually you probably won't be seeing them pre-sales probably closer to registration. Once they're registered, then I think you'll probably start seeing a sales center pop up and for the other units in the draft plan.
Yeah, no, the only one they have right now, it was the sales started 2022, April 9th, but it's supposed to be built by 2025.
Is that the condominium, Agnes?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's in zone Z or Y. It's
No,
it
and
doesn't-
N.
It's
So on the west
the-
side of
It's
Trafalgar,
on
is
the
that
other
correct?
side of Trafalgar,
It's on,
east side
well,
of
on the
Trafalgar.
map I'm looking at, it's showing me it's on the west side of Trafalgar.
The building that's coming up.
Oh no,
Agnes, can
that's
you-
already being built. This is Greenwick condos.
Okay.
So it might be that if there are, low-rise townhomes, stacked, mid-rise could probably all be accommodated at DDW. It's really just if there's a huge tower like in XYZ, that probably couldn't be. So perhaps then there would be a carve out for that, like there is in XYZ. Given what we've already heard about the ease of transportation for the really high density buildings.
And we did look at it with option number 3, the originating option. Yeah.
Yeah, and Lorene indicated that once the development plans shake out, there likely is to be maybe a future review that involves N, and some of that could be refined. But in general, if there is any density, low rise, mid rise, whatever that could be accommodated by DDW, and those kids could walk to school, it should be.
And it'll definitely be part of it. And this is from the option number 3. So yeah, it definitely boosts it up in terms of enrollment, but you're not anywhere near that 24 portable max that it is now, nor are we near the 18 portable max with the development that's within and right now. So yeah, it could be something. I think we can make it work for sure. But we'll run the numbers on that one as an alternative option. Mark?
Can I just have clarification on, you're saying that the school's not going to be built and ready in time. Say, for example, we chose 5, as the board chooses 5 as the option to go for. How does that look for 2024 in September? Because all these kind of hinge on these schools being done. So how does that look? And actually, do we just keep status quo until it's built? What happens?
It'll really depend. So just for the sake of argument, let's call it a year just to keep it simple. We have to delay it to 2025. So that means a lot of the factors that we were hoping to implement for 2024 will have to defer to 2025. So, as an example for post corners in option 5, we were hoping to move zones AI and AH to River Oaks in this circumstance here. But given the amount of students I have in AI right now and where River Oaks is in terms of its overall enrollment and max capacity, which is it's right at the fringe, I won't be able to do that next year. I need to have
everything kind of just stay status quo until the school comes in.
Well, this is one example where it would stay status quo. An alternate example here would be, zone H here, like we're talking about in our group, is kind of isolated in that it's not reliant on Oakville number 3, where this could be something, I could start moving that into Unawi next year, but it doesn't hint, and it'll start alleviating pressure at Dr. David R. Williams.
So it's where you can implement the plan, you'll implement it. Where you need to wait, you wait.
That's exactly it. Because my intent right now is going back to stability and trying to address some of these issues. I've got 2 redirections in place right now, one for Dr. David R. Williams, and I've got one for post corners where I'm having to send kids to Palermo. If I can get rid of those or at least start whittling them down, I want to start as soon as possible. But again, I don't want to create a situation where I'm going to cause more redirections. So by the time we're getting to the point of making a decision on what option we want to pick, that's when we're going to really get into it's probably after the PIM. We're going to talk about implementation as to what moves when. And that's something I'll be further refined with the BRSC and then senior staff, just to be like, okay, well, let's these are the options. We have to make them work for the timing we have with the new school openings. Eva?
So since it's safe to assume that the new schools are not going to be incorporating most likely FI, whether the school is delayed, the FI probably will still move.
That could be part of the discussion. Yeah. So that's another example where for Dr. David R. and Nude we might be able to take away that pressure from Dr. David R. and send it over to, if we're using option 5, and again, we're not making decisions here, but as option 5 as an example, you could send some of the Forest Trail and then start alleviating some of that pressure. So yes, that would be part of some of the staggered implementation or phased in implementation of the ultimate plan. But seeing the time right now, and I wanted to give a chance to my group number 1, and Heba, you're right up front right now. I'm wondering, do you want to volunteer and kind of give a synopsis of what we discussed?
Sure. So we also focus most of our attention on option 5. But before I talk about option 5, we did touch on one, I think it was option 3D or something, where we all as a group felt that the Sunningdale boundary should not be changed, because in one of the options in the FI, exactly that AC boundary was being pushed out 2 months, which is originally a Sunningdale boundary. So we all as a group hoped that we could not disturb Sunningdale and keep their boundary intact. The other thing that we liked about option 5 was that all schools in whether English or FI were staying to a large extent for most of the long-term period within their capacity with minimum portables. It was keeping the Dr. David R. Williams FI cohort from Udanawi's boundary and Dr. David R. Williams boundary together at Forest Trail, which may be a better option because it's a newer facility. So the pressure that would have happened had they gone to Sunningdale would be more, since Sunningdale does have less washroom facilities. I believe they have one for females, one for male, one for the boys. So that was one of the things we talked about. We also talked about busing issues. One of the questions raised was with so much of movement of children being bused to different schools, will that have a added pressure on the number of stops? And Andrew was kind enough to inform us that when a new zone of a route is determined, it doesn't mean that the stops increase. It's just that it's just a whole new bus. So they don't want to have children being bused for, like, one bus system is going for an hour and the other 20 minutes. So that was a question that was raised. So they do have to work with the busing. That is an ongoing issue, but hopefully that will be managed. I think that was most of the points that we touched on. I don't know if I'm missing anything.
I think that encapsulates it very well. Thank you for that, Heba. And I guess my question is we didn't talk about the other 3s and the option 4s. So, like, is there anything that kind of popped out to anyone on those options as being something that we liked, or is it mostly we were happy with the direction that option 5 had, and then reiterate some of those changes with post corners and River Oaks to see if there's other changes we can make to that are, moving AI, AH, AE, AJ around to see if we can make other variants of that option. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say, Fred, at least in our group, that option 5 seems to be pretty positively well received, but making some little bit changes again with AE, AJ, that particularly around post corners, and taking another look at zone N as well. I see Jennifer raised her hand. Jennifer Tessman.
Yes, hi. So in option 5, we talked about moving zone N for the English to David R. Williams. Would we also then, for the French immersion, move zone N to Forest Trail, or would we split them and send them to Sunningdale?
I would move them to for the same cohort. So I probably would send them off, if they're to go to Dr. David R. Williams, then I would send them off to I believe it's Forest Trail. Sorry, yes, to Forest Trail as well. if we were to make for example, a 5A with that example.
Okay, thank you.
And that's HEBA.
Oh,
Nope.
we're good. Okay.
Nope. Okay.
So I'm gonna do
Sorry,
Maybe
Hiba, I
we-
think you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh.
Yeah, could we just go back to the FI? I just want to see, was N actually in the Forest Trail line? I thought that was going to Sunningdale. Yeah, it is going to Sunningdale.
It is. So
Um,
we're going to make an alteration where if we send N to Dr. David R. Williams, like we looked at with option 3, the original one earlier, then we'll also do it for the FI. So we'll make that change.
So the other thing that we did talk about in our group was, again, the legacy of grade 7 and 8s, just because they've all grown, like in the dual track system, a lot of the kids have friends with English kids as well, and we do not want to disturb their graduation, the two graduating years out. So we'd requested if we could get more concrete numbers on what the FI would be if we had 7 and 8 stay back at DDW. And that may help some of the numbers at Forest Trail as well.
And just to clarify, now that we got Lorene back in the room, Lorene, the 8s were included in those numbers because they were just the rough cuts, right? So
I believe that the 8s were included in the rough cuts. I will have to double check that again, but I'm pretty sure that they are not part of that movement, assuming that the movement happened for the 24-25 school year. So yes, and I believe that grade 8 classes, sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. I would say it's about a classroom, but again, I could double check that. But yes,
So
grade 8
DDW,
it is included.
DDW,
Yes.
DDW, they're about two and a bit,
Yes.
2.5 classes.
There's currently 45 kids assumed
Grade 8.
that are going to remain in FI for option 5. So maybe you see if the numbers still work, if 90 stay, maybe that's grade 7 and 8.
Yeah, I would have to look at what that breakdown is intergeographically, but yes, that's correct. Yeah.
and that's the next step, everybody. So like again, these we had about a week to put all these together. So they're the rough cut estimates. So we are going to be refining them. We figured let's spot check it with everyone and make sure we have some direction as to which option seems to have some definite interest. So that's the next step I want to do right now is I'm going to throw up a Mentimeter on the screen, and I just want to get a sense from the group. What do you think of these options? Which ones? And we'll do the scale 1 to 5. What I'm hearing is probably 5 is going to stick around, but just in case there's someone else that has something to say about the other in between options. And then from that, and depending where we land at the end of this evening, what our work is going to be is refining those options and then taking them back in a more complete form to you so that we have that in consideration. And then we'll have the numbers in our back pocket too, to see what it looks like. We always assume grade 8s are going to be legacy exempt. That's pretty standard for our board, but we can definitely expand that with some of the comments on 7 and 8s as well too, to show what that looks like. So without further delay, let's just load this thing up here. This is going to be a long service, so I'm going to give you a minute to go through it. Sorry. I'll give you a few minutes to get through it. So let me just present this. All right, and again, if you just go at menti.com and you pump in that number, you will be good. I'll just put it back in the chat too. This one's 3134967.
For clarification, Fred, is this just the parent reps or is it everybody?
Oh, parent reps, please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My apologies, guys.
Sorry, where did you put the code?
Oh, it's in so you have the code up top,
Oh,
but you also have it put it in the comment box too, just to
got it.
make
Thank you.
life a bit easier. right, so we're at about 6 responses. Let's give another minute. So we got about 11 response, so I'll just don't feel too rushed. We've got 12 now. So I think it's very clear, like we're really happy with option number 5 on this one, and that we'll develop some further iterations of that to further refine it. And Lorraine, I'm thinking we'll probably be able to squeeze out another 2 options out of 5, right? 5A, 5B in terms of some of the permutations there.
I think so. I think taking a look at the that post corners boundary is one. Taking a look at zone AH, potentially maybe splitting that up into 2 different zones, and then taking another look at zone N and seeing what we could do with that. Yes.
Okay. All right. So thanks everyone for voting.
I have one
go ahead,
quick question. So zone N right now, it doesn't have anyone living there right now, correct?
That's correct.
So given that it is going to be 600 plus, so it's going to be high density, would that push forest trail numbers actually higher then? I mean, I'm just wondering, like, since I understand we want to keep cohorts together, but it's not really an established cohort yet. So, and I'm talking in terms of FI. You know how we wanted to include zone N FI with Forest Trail instead of Sunningdale, given that both are smaller capacity schools and zone N is a big density zone and it's not currently inhabitable, like there's no cohort existing. Adding that to Forest Trail instead of keeping that cohort in Sunningdale may actually be better. I'm just putting the thought out there.
So what we can definitely do is like Lorena's going to look at the numbers and seeing what it comes out to with Forest Trail. So with the FI, it's not all the kids are going to go. We're going to make an assumption as what's reflected what we've seen in the past there. But we do have a good idea of what's being proposed in that area because a lot of development applications have been circulated. So like we know a lot of it's going to be single family and townhouse dwellings with some high rise down some of the corridor areas. So we do have that information available. So I don't think it's something that would break forest trails, but again, when we go back to this process, when we're talking about Oakville 4 down the way, it's kind of like what I mentioned earlier, is maybe down the road when other schools start stabilizing, maybe FI is back into the picture in the north now that we have the resources and the ability to do so. Maybe it's part of that boundary then, or, I think we can deal with it at that point in time. But Lorene's going to look at the numbers just to confirm, what does that look like based on the development applications that have been circulated to date in that area, which we have a lot of them. A lot of it's been provided. Jessica?
I just wanted to say, in case it wasn't clear earlier, that if N is going to include, if the future development of N is going to include a really high density buildings like in X, Y, Z, it probably will need to be N and NA or whatever, because DDW is not going to be able to absorb that in the English program, nor will Forest Trail be able to absorb it in the FI program. So if there is really high density, there has to be a separate plan for that anyway, Hiba. Like it would only be, can we absorb the low density mid-rise townhome stacked, like that kind of thing? Can we absorb that? Because neither DDW nor Forest Trail could absorb a 60-story high-rise.
So what I'll say is based on the development yields we have made it fit into DDRW. I don't know Forest Trail. We haven't looked at that one yet, so we'll confirm that. Just another thing too, just to attenuate some concerns on that, if we start seeing some corridor areas start coming in like XYZ, which we're aware of, but down the road with N, that's certainly something we can cut off as new development areas, and maybe just say, you know what, you're going to Oakville number 4 or something like that. So we do have some latitude and flexibility down the road because it is so far out that we'll be able to fix that in the later process. Magdas?
I have a question about X. So part of X, can you just confirm what is this line that it's going up to? Is it 8th line? Oh, sorry, not 8th line. It isn't. So this is all just up to what's that road called? Let me just pull it up.
It's up to
William
Wheaton.
Hall.
Post Ridge.
It goes
Yeah.
it goes to Post Ridge Drive. Yes, that
Oh.
eastern boundary of X
Okay,
is
got
Post
it.
Ridge Drive. Yes, and then it kind of cuts through the center line of some of the roads there along Silver Maple
Yeah.
Road, and then
Yeah.
up along the pond, and then it's a pretty clear cut boundary that follows the existing road network and the park as well.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Because sorry, could you put up number 5 again?
English or FI?
English. So just tell me again, where is X going?
It's going to hold at Falgarwood, and eventually when Oakville number 4 opens up, probably that whole corridor is going to go to Oakville number 4. And I'll be honest, Q more than likely will probably also make its way because they're going to be able to walk right up to it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's going to be part of that review down the road.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I didn't close out on this discussion here. My bad. So based on this, what I'm hearing is and I just want to make sure instead of going through the next question, which is which ones should we remove in terms of options, we're not going to look at options 1 through 4B on this one. We're just going to table them and say, okay, let's refine 5 and let's kind of get our short list out of that. Is that fair to say from the group?
I like that. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so that's how we're going to proceed then, moving forward. So I think, like I said, by that point, that means that tonight we did some hard work. So we're down to one option, which is pretty fantastic, with 2 to 3 iterations from that. So I think we have enough to go on based on that. Unless there's other options or other considerations that the group would like to discuss, I think what we can do is say we're relatively good with 5 and the 2 to 3 iterations we're going to make off of that. And then when we meet back, and I'm thinking we probably don't need to connect next week. We could probably wait till November 16th. We'll be able to refine that down to 2 to 3 options for the community. I get kind of are people generally okay with that? Or if someone has concerns, just by all means raise it. No, Jessica?
Perhaps the extra week would also give time, seeing as we are really focused in on option 5, maybe that would also give time to consider the legacy, whatever they are, the legacy exemptions, because this group is very concerned with that. So honestly, I think without that, seeing it, if we skip next week and we have 2 weeks before our next meeting, getting some clarity on that now that we're sort of focused in on option 5, I think would, no one's gonna, I don't think any parent is gonna commit to option 5 or any iteration on it. Like, I think the option for legacy exemption is likely to be a tiebreaker on option 5A, 5B, 5C, etc.
Yeah. So we can definitely put in some thoughts on what staff's perspective on legacy exemption would be for next week in terms of what maybe we could get in out of the gates, like usually when I go to the PIM, I'd like to just say grade 8s are usually what we would legacy exempt and see what the community says, which I assume that based on a couple options, because again, next week or the next meeting isn't to refine down to one option. I want to have a few, 3 max, to go to the community with and say, what do you guys think? And then we could probably put in some, we're going to legacy exempt grade 8s for sure. And then the other ones, the next meeting we have together is really dive into that. It's like, okay, how far could we go to make it work while still being sustainable? And then kind of do the refinement there. We can certainly have that conversation too next week, but I'd want to go in the PIM with at least some consideration of here's the base options, and let's go from there. Is that fair?
November 16th. The plan is that we don't need to meet next week. We'd meet November 16th.
That's correct. We'll look over these the set of 5, the option 5 set. We'll talk with you about what we could potentially get through with legacy exemption. But when we go to the public information meeting on November 23rd, I'd stick to just grade 8s is what we'll present to them, get the feedback, and then when we meet after that meeting, we're going to really go into, okay, well, how are we going to do the implementation? What's the legacy exemption, and what are the option or options you want to present to the BRSC, so as what you want to recommend, and then we would take that back to the director afterwards to then eventually go to the trustees.
Okay.
Cool. All right, Macus, and then if anyone else has comments on that one. I think I lost it.
Would we be meeting virtually on the following weekend? The following week?
For November 16th, I was going to bookend this and have a good evening. I was going to bookend this, and we'll have the first and the last as in person. We could, and the last one is usually after the feedback we receive from the community. So that one I was planning on being in person, and then the next one I was thinking virtual for November 16th.
Can I just put in a request before everyone leaves? And of course, I'm the only person, then do whatever is best for everyone. But November 16th, River Oaks has like a World Fair going on. And if we can do next week rather than November 16th, I would really appreciate it.
I don't know if we'd be ready. What's the...
I mean, if you can't, it's fine. I will still join virtually, but I volunteered there, so I was hoping if it was possible then. But if it's not, it's okay. I can help set up and then join the meeting.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, Macus, I think it's gonna be tough to maybe reschedule that one. And if we want to get all the other refinements and the numbers done, but I don't think we have enough time in a week.
Okay.
Next week was more if we want to do a number of new options, or if we didn't get as far as I didn't expect tonight. So
what I can do to maybe somewhat accommodate that is that since we have a couple of weeks, I might be able to get the any kind of options, or at least the mapping and general numbers to everyone before the next meeting, so you can have eyes on it before the actual meeting. And if you even want to provide preliminary comments through email or send it off with your counterpart for the next meeting, we can do it that way as well. So I hope to have these new options to you before the next meeting.
Okay, and I know you guys have access, and you've taken into consideration what is being built in the vacant areas right now. But as for the parents that are joining the meeting, I think it would be good if they knew what's coming up in those places. So when we do make a decision on something, it's important to know what kind of development's happening over there before you decide to add that area into.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? Yeah, we did develop some development mapping for another project. Lorene, maybe we can share the development maps we did for capital priorities.
Yeah, they wouldn't be in. Yeah, it was specific areas and they weren't in great detail, but we can provide that mapping in terms of the general growth areas in North Oakville. But I do have numbers as well. So I might not have the mapping, but I have broken up by zone the number of development applications that have been submitted so far and the number of units that are within those zones as well. So that's information that can be easily shared in a spreadsheet if you want
No,
to take a look at
I'm
that.
just saying, Lorraine, like for the sake of this boundary
Mhm.
review, we want to only look at what's possibly already approved, just because that's going to come up in the next few years. If something's like still going to be approved and be built in like say 6 years down the road, that's probably going to be part of another review meeting anyway. So that being said, whatever is currently approved and being built, I have access to that. If you want, I could share that information with you. And it shows on the map exactly where it's going to be built, how many units, and when it's going to be built by.
Yeah, if you want to take it offline, Magnus, and send that over to us by all means, and then we can compare notes. But what I will say is whatever development application is in our door right now we know about, they're in these numbers. So anything
Okay,
that's been
perfect.
circulated to us has been incorporated in this. So it's the, and North Oakville has had a lot of applications and a lot of it is in. So we've got a good sense of, what this whole thing's going to look like down the road.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I'm sure you guys have all the numbers in front of you, but I was just saying for the sake of the parents that are on the committee, so they know, just like our discussion over and whether it should be part of David R. Williams or not, like it makes a huge difference.
Appreciated. All right, so Champa, I'm gonna give you the last word, and then we'll close out.
I just had a small request. Is it possible to start the meetings a little earlier, since we always move up till 9 o'clock? Is it possible to start by around 6:30 or 6:45? Is that possible?
I'm gonna take a guess here, but like the BRC meets beforehand, so we can. I think that meeting we can certainly just shorten that one and start at 6:30 if that's amenable to everyone else. I don't see an issue. Is that okay with everyone else, or?
I'm good with that.
Thank you.
Good.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks everyone again for tonight's session. There, I think extremely productive. I really do appreciate the thought behind all of the comments and participating in the process. I know it ain't easy, so it's very well appreciated. So thanks again. We will keep in touch, as Lorraine said, as we get some stuff out the door. We'll get it to you as soon as possible. And I think we're good to not proceed with the meeting next week. So that way, when it comes time for the November 16th meeting, like I said, we'll shortlist. We'll review the new options. We'll shortlist which ones we want to present. We'll talk to you about what the pin's going to look like. And the feedback survey will be releasing ahead of time and reviewing afterwards. And that'll be it. If there's any questions or comments or any new things that pop up, by all means, email us and we'll respond accordingly. For those that sent us emails along the way, we're working on them and we'll provide you a response. If there's anything else, we'll share with the group too. That's maybe for the wider discussion. So with that, if there's no further questions or comments, by all means, thanks again for tonight. It's appreciated. Oh, did forget one thing. We are going to need some volunteers to present at the public information meeting. Usually we like to have a parent perspective, as to how the process is or what your thoughts are. The floor is yours. So it's usually 2 to 3 minutes between 1 or 2 parents. Given the group that we have, I think 2's fine. I'll leave it with you, and we'll badger you again on November 16th to get some volunteers.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Have a great evening, and thanks again.
Good night.
Thank you. Good
Thank you.
night.
Good night.
Everyone.